Welcome back to the Biblical Mystery Channel. Today's new story is the untold story of Caleb. When an entire nation lost faith, one man didn't. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For most of his life, Caleb stood in the shadow of bigger names. Moses led Israel out of Egypt. Joshua led the conquest of Canaan. But Caleb was different. He was not a prophet, not a king, not even the primary leader of his generation. Yet the Bible gives him one of the highest compliments ever spoken about a human being. It says he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. What made this man so extraordinary? Why did God preserve him when an entire generation fell in the wilderness? And how did an 85-year-old warrior become the man who finally conquered the very giants that once terrified a nation? To understand the answer, we have to travel back to a time of deserts, promises, fear, and faith. Because the complete story of Caleb is not just the story of one man. It is the story of unwavering trust in God when everyone else chose fear. The story of Caleb begins with a mystery. Unlike Moses, whose birth and early life are described in detail, or David, whose rise from shepherd to king forms one of the Bible's most famous narratives, Caleb enters the biblical record with almost no introduction. The scriptures provide no account of his childhood, no dramatic calling, and no defining event from his early years. Instead, he appears as an already established leader, a man trusted enough to represent one of Israel's most influential tribes. Yet, hidden within the few details that are given, lies a question that has intrigued biblical scholars for centuries. Caleb is repeatedly identified as the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. To modern readers, this may seem like a minor genealogical note. In the ancient world, however, ancestry carried enormous significance. Family origins shaped identity, inheritance, political relationships, and social belonging. Because of that, the reference to Caleb as a Kenizzite has generated a long-running discussion among historians and biblical researchers. The term itself appears in earlier biblical traditions associated with groups living in or around the land of Canaan. This has led some scholars to suggest that Caleb's ancestors may have originally belonged to a clan that was later incorporated into the tribe of Judah. Others argue that the designation may simply reflect a branch within Judah that carried an older clan identity. The available evidence does not allow a definitive conclusion, which is why responsible scholarship treats the question with caution rather than certainty. What can be said with confidence is that the biblical text preserves the title intentionally. The authors could have identified Caleb solely through his tribal affiliation, yet they repeatedly retain the description, Kenizzite. The fact that this detail remains attached to his name suggests that it carried meaning for the earliest audiences who encountered the story. Regardless of the precise historical explanation, the narrative itself reveals something important. Caleb never appears as a marginal figure struggling to gain acceptance. From his earliest appearance, he occupies a position of influence and respect within Judah. When Moses later selects representatives for the reconnaissance mission into Canaan, Caleb stands among the leaders chosen to speak on behalf of their tribes. Such responsibility was not given lightly. Tribal representatives functioned as trusted figures whose judgment carried weight among their people. Caleb's selection indicates that by this stage he had already established a reputation for reliability and leadership. This observation opens a fascinating window into the development of ancient Israel. Modern readers often imagine biblical tribes as fixed ethnic groups with rigid boundaries stretching back unchanged through the centuries. The historical reality was almost certainly more complex. Across the ancient Near East, communities regularly absorbed smaller clans, allied families, and neighboring groups. Identity was shaped not only by ancestry but also by loyalty, shared experiences, political relationships, and participation in common religious traditions. Israel itself emerged through a long process of formation. The preservation of Caleb's Kenizzite designation may reflect traces of that larger historical reality, reminding readers that the nation developed through a combination of covenant identity and social integration, rather than through simplistic ethnic categories alone. Another intriguing aspect of Caleb's introduction concerns what the biblical writers choose not to emphasize. Many prominent figures are presented through extraordinary beginnings. Isaac was born through a miraculous promise. Joseph experienced prophetic dreams. Samuel received a unique calling as a child. Caleb receives none of these narrative features. The absence is striking. The text appears intentionally uninterested in creating a heroic origin story. Instead, Caleb's importance emerges gradually through his decisions. His significance is not rooted in unusual circumstances surrounding his birth. It develops through the consistent pattern of his character. This literary approach creates an important contrast with many ancient heroic traditions, where greatness is often established through legendary ancestry or supernatural beginnings. Caleb's story unfolds in the opposite direction. Readers first encounter an ordinary leader. His extraordinary qualities become visible only when history places him under pressure. Even his name has attracted attention. The Hebrew name Caleb is commonly associated with the word for dog. While modern cultures often view dogs primarily as household companions, ancient societies connected them with different ideas, including vigilance, persistence, and loyalty. Scholars remain cautious about assigning symbolic meanings based solely on names, yet the association is difficult to overlook, whether intentional or not. The qualities traditionally connected to the name align remarkably well with the traits Caleb later displays throughout the biblical narrative. Loyalty becomes one of the defining themes of his life. Before Caleb ever reaches the borders of Canaan, another important reality deserves consideration. He belonged to a generation that witnessed some of the most dramatic events in Israel's history. He saw the collapse of Egyptian power. He experienced the journey into the wilderness. He stood among a people learning how to function as a covenant community under God's guidance. These experiences shaped everyone around him, yet they did not shape everyone in the same way. The same events produced different responses in different individuals. Some developed resilience and trust. Others became increasingly controlled by uncertainty. The contrast would eventually become one of the central themes of the wilderness generation. Caleb's story cannot be understood apart from this larger environment because his character was revealed within it. At this stage, however, the most important observation is surprisingly simple. The Bible introduces Caleb without prestige, without dramatic achievements, and without elaborate explanations. What it provides instead are small details that invite careful attention. A leader from Judah, a man associated with the Kenizzites, a participant in Israel's formative years. Nothing about these facts would have suggested that he would become one of the most admired examples of faithfulness in the entire Old Testament. Yet that is precisely what makes his story compelling. Caleb begins not as a legend, but as a largely unknown figure standing quietly within the larger history of Israel. The greatness associated with his name would not come from where he started. It would emerge from the choices he made when confronted with moments that tested the convictions of an entire nation. By the time Caleb emerged as a recognized leader within Judah, Israel was living through one of the most unusual periods in its history. The nation existed, yet it did not possess a homeland. It had escaped the control of Egypt, yet it had not settled in the land promised to its ancestors. It was no longer a collection of enslaved families, but it had not fully become the society it was destined to be. The wilderness years unfolded within this space between deliverance and fulfillment. For Caleb and his generation, life was defined not by permanence, but by movement. Camps were established and dismantled. Journeys began and ended. The landscape changed constantly. What remained unchanged was the challenge of learning how to live as God's covenant people, while the future still lay ahead. To understand Caleb's world, it is important to recognize that the Exodus solved only one part of Israel's problem. Freedom from oppression did not automatically create a mature nation. Ancient societies were shaped over generations through institutions, traditions, legal systems, and collective memory. Israel had left Egypt carrying very little of that infrastructure. The people possessed a shared ancestry and a shared story, but they still had to learn how to function as a covenant community. This process began at Mount Sinai, where the nation received laws governing worship, justice, leadership, and daily life. The significance of Sinai cannot be overstated. Before this moment, Israel was primarily connected by family heritage. After Sinai, it was connected by covenant. The people were no longer simply descendants of Abraham. They were participants in a national relationship with the God who had delivered them. Caleb belonged to the first generation, called to live under this new reality. Every aspect of life was being reshaped: religious identity, social responsibility, and communal expectations were all undergoing transformation. The wilderness therefore functioned as more than a geographical environment. It became a classroom in which an entire nation was being formed. Yet education does not guarantee acceptance of what is being taught. The biblical record repeatedly reveals tension between God's intentions and the people's responses. Complaints surfaced over food. Concerns arose regarding water. Questions emerged about leadership. These incidents were not isolated episodes disconnected from one another. Together, they exposed a deeper issue. Many Israelites struggled to trust a future they could not yet see. Their uncertainty did not always arise from rebellion in the dramatic sense. More often, it reflected the habits and assumptions developed during generations of dependence in Egypt. Slavery had shaped expectations. Decisions were made by others. Security, however limited, came from established systems. Freedom required something different. It required responsibility, initiative, and confidence in God's guidance. Those qualities often proved difficult to develop. One of the most revealing moments during this period occurred at Sinai itself. While Moses remained on the mountain, many among the people turned toward the creation of the golden calf. The episode demonstrated how quickly fear and uncertainty could redirect collective behavior. The issue was not simply idolatry. It was the desire for something visible and controllable in place of trust. Human beings have often preferred certainty over faith, even when that certainty proves false. The golden calf incident exposed a tendency that would continue appearing throughout the wilderness years. Whenever uncertainty increased, many people instinctively searched for alternatives that felt more predictable. This broader pattern forms the backdrop against which Caleb's character eventually becomes visible. The biblical narrative offers almost no direct commentary about his personal thoughts during these years. Instead, readers learn about him indirectly by observing the environment around him. Caleb experienced the same hardships as everyone else. He traveled the same roads. He endured the same shortages. He listened to the same complaints and witnessed the same crises. Nothing suggests he lived in a protected sphere separated from the struggles of his generation. What makes his later actions remarkable is precisely this shared experience. He was not faithful because he enjoyed easier circumstances. He was faithful while facing the same realities that shaped everyone around him. As the years progressed, Another theme gradually moved toward the center of Israel's national consciousness. The promise of Canaan became increasingly tangible. For centuries, the land had existed primarily within ancestral traditions. Abraham had been told that his descendants would inherit it. Isaac received the same assurance. Jacob carried that expectation into the next generation. Now, for the first time, the fulfillment of those promises seemed within reach. The wilderness journey was not endless wandering without direction. It was movement toward a specific destination. Every stage of the journey pointed toward the same objective. Yet, anticipation can produce mixed reactions. For some, the approaching promise generated hope. For others, it generated anxiety. Entering Canaan would require confronting realities that could not be avoided. Established cities occupied the land. Local rulers controlled strategic regions. Military resistance was inevitable. The closer Israel moved toward its inheritance, the more pressing these realities became. The challenge facing the nation was therefore not merely whether the land existed. The challenge was whether the people believed God could bring them into it. This distinction is crucial because it reveals the true nature of the test approaching on the horizon. The central question was never geographical. It was theological. Would Israel interpret the future through the lens of God's covenant or through the lens of its own limitations? By this stage, Caleb had already become one of the respected figures within Judah. Although Scripture provides few details regarding his rise to leadership, his later selection for a critical national mission indicates that he had earned substantial trust. Leaders are rarely chosen in moments of crisis without prior evidence of reliability. Long before Caleb's name became associated with courage, he had evidently established a reputation that others recognized. Soon, that reputation would face its greatest test. Israel was approaching the southern frontier of Canaan. The time for preparation was ending. Information would soon be gathered. Decisions would soon be made. The generation formed in the wilderness was about to confront the future it had spent years discussing. When 12 representatives were chosen to enter the land and evaluate what lay ahead, Caleb would stand among them. The mission itself would last only 40 days. Its consequences would shape the next 40 years. After years of wandering through the wilderness, Israel finally arrived at a moment that previous generations could only imagine. The land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob no longer existed as a distant hope preserved through stories. It stood directly ahead. The southern approaches of Canaan stretched beyond the horizon, separating the nation from an inheritance that had shaped its identity for centuries. Yet, before any large-scale movement into the territory could begin, Moses authorized a reconnaissance mission designed to gather critical information about the land and its inhabitants. According to the biblical account, 12 men were selected, one from each tribe. Their task was both practical and strategic. They would travel through Canaan, observe its geography, examine its agricultural potential, evaluate local populations, and assess the challenges Israel might face in the future. Among the representatives stood Caleb, chosen to speak on behalf of Judah. His selection reveals how far he had already risen within the national community. Judah was not a minor tribe. It occupied a position of growing importance among the Israelites and would later become the dominant tribe in Israel's history. A representative chosen from Judah needed more than physical courage. He needed judgment, credibility, and the trust of his people. Caleb clearly possessed those qualities before the mission ever began. The assignment itself carried significant risks. Ancient reconnaissance missions required individuals to move through unfamiliar territory without attracting unwanted attention. Unlike modern military operations, there were no maps, aerial surveys, or communication networks. Information could only be gathered through direct observation, Every city entered and every road traveled introduced uncertainty. The spies would be operating inside a region occupied by established communities, whose interests were unlikely to align with those of an approaching population seeking settlement. The journey, therefore, demanded caution, as well as determination. The biblical narrative states that the mission lasted 40 days. During that period, the spies traveled through a region far more diverse than many modern readers imagine. Canaan was not a single political unit controlled by one ruler. Instead, it consisted of numerous city-states, local kingdoms, agricultural zones, trade routes, and population centers spread across varied terrain. Mountainous areas dominated parts of the interior. Fertile valleys supported farming communities. Strategic roads connected different regions of the eastern Mediterranean world. The land occupied a position of considerable importance because it sat between larger powers competing for influence throughout the ancient Near East. Anyone hoping to settle there would inevitably encounter both opportunity and resistance. As the spies advanced deeper into the territory, one reality quickly became impossible to ignore. The land possessed extraordinary agricultural potential. This discovery confirmed a theme already embedded within Israel's traditions. Canaan was not merely habitable, it was productive. The famous episode involving the cluster of grapes from the valley of Eshcol illustrates this point vividly. According to the biblical account, the fruit gathered there was so substantial that it required 2 men to carry it suspended from a pole, alongside figs and pomegranates. These items served as physical evidence of the land's fertility. For a generation accustomed to the harsh conditions of the wilderness, such abundance would have made a powerful impression. The promise associated with Canaan was no longer theoretical. It could be touched, carried, and displayed before the people. Yet, the mission revealed more than agricultural prosperity. The spies also encountered a region already occupied by populations with established social and political structures. Archaeological research into the late Bronze Age supports the broader picture of a landscape containing fortified settlements, regional power centers, and interconnected communities. While scholars continue debating the precise historical circumstances surrounding Israel's arrival in Canaan, there is little doubt that the territory was neither empty nor defenseless. Any future settlement effort would involve navigating complex realities rather than simply moving into vacant land. The reconnaissance mission therefore provided information that was encouraging and challenging at the same time. Among the most memorable observations involved a group known as the Anakim. Their appearance within the biblical narrative has generated centuries of discussion. The text portrays them as unusually imposing figures whose reputation inspired fear. Later traditions would associate them with accounts of giants and legendary warriors. Historians and biblical scholars continue debating how such descriptions should be interpreted. Some suggest memories of unusually tall populations contributed to the tradition. Others argue that the language reflects military reputation expressed through ancient literary conventions. Whatever the precise explanation, the effect on the spies was undeniable. The Anakim represented a formidable presence within the land. Their reputation would eventually become one of the most influential factors in the events that followed. What makes this stage of the story particularly fascinating is that the mission itself was a success. The spies completed their assignment. They gathered information. They confirmed the fertility of the land. They identified strengths and weaknesses within the region. In purely operational terms, the expedition achieved its objective. Nothing about the reconnaissance failed. The significance of this observation often goes unnoticed because readers already know the controversy that follows. Yet before the crisis began, the mission had produced exactly what it was designed to produce. Information was available. The challenge now lay in determining how that information should be understood. As the 40 days came to an end, the 12 men began their journey back to the Israelite camp. They carried physical evidence of the land's abundance and first-hand knowledge of its realities. Soon they would stand before Moses, the tribal leaders, and the wider community. The report they delivered would influence decisions affecting an entire generation. At this stage, however, the outcome remained unwritten. The spies had seen fertile valleys, productive farmland, fortified cities, and powerful inhabitants. They had observed opportunity and risk existing side by side. The facts themselves were not in dispute. What remained uncertain was which aspects of those observations would dominate the conversation once the nation heard the report. The answer to that question would shape one of the most important turning points in Caleb's life and one of the most consequential moments in Israel's early history. When the 12 spies returned to the Israelite camp, they brought with them something the nation had lacked for generations. They brought certainty. For centuries, the Promised Land had existed primarily within stories passed down from fathers to sons. Now, there were eyewitnesses. There were descriptions, observations, and physical evidence gathered directly from the land itself. Thousands of people waited to hear what the spies had discovered. The atmosphere must have been charged with anticipation. Families who had spent years traveling through the wilderness were about to learn what awaited them beyond the frontier. The report began with encouraging news. The spies confirmed that Canaan was exactly what Israel had been told it would be. The land was productive, fertile, and capable of sustaining a large population. The fruit carried back from the valley of Eshcol provided visible proof. In that sense, the mission validated the promise. No one could claim the land had been exaggerated or misrepresented. The territory truly possessed remarkable agricultural wealth. Had the report ended there, the story might have unfolded very differently. Instead, attention shifted toward another subject. The spies began describing the people who occupied the land. They spoke about fortified cities, organized communities, and powerful populations living throughout the region. These observations were accurate. Archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age confirms that many settlements in Canaan were protected by defensive structures and governed by local rulers. Entering such a region would never have been simple. The challenge facing Israel was genuine, yet the tone of the report gradually changed as those realities became the center of discussion. The abundance of the land moved into the background. The obstacles moved to the foreground. What had initially sounded like a description increasingly began to sound like a warning. Among the most influential details involved the Anakim. The spies described them as imposing figures whose presence left a powerful impression. Whether the language should be understood literally, symbolically, or through a combination of both remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What matters for the narrative is the reaction they produced. The Anakim quickly became the focal point of the entire conversation. Rather than discussing vineyards, farmland, and inheritance, the people became fixated on the enemies who stood between them and those things. The report had not merely communicated information, it had reshaped the nation's attention. This development reveals something important about human behavior. Information rarely affects people in a neutral way. Facts are filtered through emotions, expectations, and prior experiences. Israel did not hear the report as detached observers. They heard it as former slaves standing on the edge of an uncertain future. For generations, they had lived under the authority of stronger powers. They knew what it felt like to be vulnerable. They knew what it meant to be dominated by others. Those memories inevitably influenced how they processed the news. The issue was not simply what the spies reported. The issue was how the people interpreted what they heard. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. According to the biblical account, fear spread throughout the camp. Families wept during the night. Complaints multiplied. Confidence dissolved. What makes this response so striking is how rapidly it developed. The same people who had celebrated deliverance from Egypt now found themselves questioning whether the journey should continue at all. The destination that once represented hope suddenly appeared dangerous. Canaan had not changed. The perception of Canaan had changed. This distinction is critical because it highlights one of the central themes of the wilderness narratives. Reality remained constant. Interpretation shifted. The emotional collapse that followed was not merely about military concerns. It exposed a deeper crisis involving identity and memory, faced with uncertainty. Many Israelites began looking backward rather than forward. Some even suggested returning to Egypt. This proposal remains one of the most astonishing moments in the Pentateuch. Egypt was the place from which they had cried out for deliverance. Egypt was where they had endured oppression and forced labor. Yet, fear possesses a remarkable ability to alter perspective. Difficult memories become softened. Familiar suffering begins to appear preferable to unfamiliar challenges. The future becomes threatening precisely because it has not yet been experienced. Israel's longing for Egypt revealed how quickly anxiety can distort historical memory. The nation's response also demonstrated the influence of collective emotion. Fear rarely remains isolated within individuals. It spreads through conversations, assumptions, and shared expectations. Once enough people embrace a particular interpretation of events, that interpretation can begin to feel self-evident, even when alternative perspectives exist. The camp at Kadesh Barnea became an example of this phenomenon. Concerns that may have begun with a handful of voices soon evolved into a national crisis. The momentum of public opinion grew stronger with each expression of doubt. Under such conditions, caution transformed into panic, and concern transformed into rebellion. Yet, one aspect of the story is often overlooked. The report itself did not force the people to react in this way. The information presented contained both opportunities and dangers. The land was fertile. The cities were fortified. The inhabitants were strong. All of those statements could be true simultaneously. The crucial question concerned which reality would ultimately shape the nation's decision. Would Israel define its future by the promise that had brought them to this point? Or would it define its future by the obstacles still standing ahead? The answer was beginning to emerge, and it was not encouraging, as frustration intensified throughout the camp. Moses and the leadership faced a growing challenge. The discussion was no longer centered on strategy. It had become a debate about whether the nation should move forward at all. Voices advocating retreat gained influence. The confidence that had carried Israel through previous stages of the journey seemed to be evaporating. Yet, amid the growing turmoil, not everyone accepted the direction in which events were moving. Among the 12 spies stood a man who had walked through the same land, seen the same cities, and encountered the same inhabitants. Caleb listened as fear spread across the camp, but he reached a very different conclusion about what the future required. The next words he spoke would define the rest of his life. As fear swept through the Israelite camp, the crisis reached a point where silence became a decision in itself. Thousands of voices were now moving in the same direction. Complaints echoed across the community. Families questioned the purpose of the journey. Discussions about entering Canaan were being replaced by discussions about retreat. Under such circumstances, the easiest response would have been to blend into the crowd. History repeatedly shows that public opinion exerts tremendous pressure on individuals, especially during moments of uncertainty. Most people prefer belonging to conflict. They would rather agree with the majority than risk standing apart from it. Caleb chose the more difficult path. According to the biblical account, he attempted to quiet the people before Moses and urged them to proceed into the land. The significance of that moment is easy to underestimate, because readers already know Caleb as a heroic figure. For those standing in the camp, however, He was confronting a frightened nation at the height of its anxiety. The people were not calmly evaluating evidence. Emotions were running high. Frustration was turning into rebellion. Any voice challenging the dominant mood risked becoming a target. Caleb understood this, yet he spoke anyway. What makes his response particularly remarkable is that he never tried to minimize the challenge. He did not claim the cities were weak. He did not dismiss the presence of the Anakim. He did not argue that military resistance would be easy. The biblical narrative offers no indication that Caleb disagreed with the factual observations gathered during the mission. His disagreement centered elsewhere. He objected to the conclusion being drawn from those observations. This distinction lies at the heart of the entire episode. Caleb was not denying reality. He was refusing to allow one part of reality to eclipse everything else. At this stage, the discussion unfolding within Israel revealed two fundamentally different ways of viewing the future. One perspective concentrated almost entirely on visible circumstances. From that viewpoint, the calculations appeared discouraging. The inhabitants possessed cities. The cities possessed defenses. The defenders knew the terrain. Israel lacked permanent settlements and had spent years in the wilderness. Evaluated purely through conventional political and military categories, caution seemed reasonable, yet Caleb approached the situation from a different starting point. He believed the covenant relationship between God and Israel had to remain part of the equation. Removing that factor fundamentally changed the analysis. Including it fundamentally changed the analysis as well. The difference between these two approaches explains why people observing the same situation arrived at radically different conclusions. This moment reveals an important feature of biblical faith that is often misunderstood. Faith in Scripture is not presented as wishful thinking or blind optimism. Caleb was not simply hoping that events would work out favorably. His confidence rested on a specific historical foundation. He had witnessed the Exodus. He had seen Egypt's power broken. He had watched the nation survive challenges that appeared impossible at the time. The God who delivered Israel from Pharaoh had not suddenly become incapable of fulfilling the next stage of his promise. Caleb's trust emerged from memory as much as expectation. The future made sense because of what God had already done in the past. Numbers 14 expands this confrontation further. Joshua joined Caleb in challenging the growing panic and urging the people not to rebel against the Lord. Together, they argued that the land was exceedingly good and that God could bring Israel into it. Yet, even with two respected leaders presenting an alternative perspective, the reaction remained hostile. The crowd did not celebrate their courage. It did not engage their reasoning. Instead, the biblical text records a movement toward violence. The situation deteriorated so rapidly that the possibility of stoning them emerged. This detail reveals how far the crisis had progressed. What began as a discussion about the land had evolved into open resistance against any message encouraging trust. Fear had become more than an emotion. It had become a framework through which every opposing voice was interpreted. The hostility directed toward Caleb also highlights the cost of conviction. Popular culture often celebrates courage after the outcome is known. Real courage operates before the outcome is certain. Caleb had no guarantee the people would listen. He had no assurance that events would turn in his favor. In fact, every immediate sign pointed in the opposite direction. The majority disagreed with him. Public opinion opposed him. The atmosphere grew increasingly volatile. Nevertheless, he remained committed to what he believed was true. This willingness to maintain conviction under pressure would become one of the defining characteristics of his life. The event also marks the first time readers see Caleb acting as more than a representative of Judah. He becomes a moral and spiritual leader. His importance no longer derives primarily from his position within a tribe. It derives from his response during a national crisis. Many leaders perform effectively when circumstances are stable. Fewer reveal their true character when stability disappears. Moments of uncertainty expose priorities that remain hidden during ordinary times. The rebellion at Kadesh Barnea served exactly that function. It exposed what mattered most to the people. For many Israelites, immediate security took precedence over future promise. For Caleb, trust in God's covenant remained the controlling priority. Another fascinating dimension of this episode involves timing. Caleb's position eventually proved correct, but that correctness was not immediately rewarded. Modern readers sometimes assume faithfulness naturally leads to rapid success. The biblical narrative often tells a different story. Being right did not spare Caleb from the consequences of the nation's decision. He would soon spend decades in the wilderness alongside the very people who rejected his counsel. This reality makes his stand even more impressive. He was not defending a position because it offered personal advantage. He was defending it because he believed it reflected the truth. As the confrontation intensified, the future of an entire generation hung in the balance. The people had heard the reports. They had heard the warnings. They had heard the appeals of Caleb and Joshua. A choice now stood before them. The decision would determine far more than whether Israel entered Canaan immediately. It would reveal how the nation understood its relationship with God. At that critical moment, the majority chose fear over trust. The consequences would extend far beyond a single failed opportunity. They would reshape the course of Israel's history for decades to come. For Caleb, however, the events at Kadesh Barnea established a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life, long before he conquered Hebron, long before he received his inheritance, and long before Scripture described him as one who followed the Lord wholeheartedly. He demonstrated a quality that distinguished him from almost everyone around him. When the crowd moved in one direction, he possessed the courage to stand still. The decision at Kadesh Barnea did more than postpone Israel's entry into Canaan. It altered the destiny of an entire generation. After hearing the complaints, rebellion, and calls to abandon the journey, God responded with a judgment that would become one of the defining moments of the wilderness era. According to the biblical account, the generation that had witnessed the Exodus yet refused to trust God at the edge of the promised land would not be the generation that inherited it. The people who feared entering Canaan would spend the remainder of their lives outside it. What could have become the final stage of Israel's journey suddenly expanded into decades. The nation would continue moving, but it would no longer be moving toward immediate fulfillment. The contrast between the offense and the judgment is striking. The people had not suffered a military defeat. They had not been driven back by superior armies. No enemy had prevented them from entering the land. The barrier emerged from within Israel itself. This is one reason the episode occupies such an important place in biblical theology. The greatest obstacle was not the strength of Canaan's inhabitants. It was the inability of the people to trust God's promise when faced with uncertainty. The judgment reflected that reality. The generation that rejected the opportunity would not participate in its fulfillment. Yet the narrative does not present judgment as the only theme. Alongside the announcement of consequences appears a powerful expression of mercy. While the nation would endure the results of its decision, God did not abandon his covenant with Israel. The promise to Abraham remained intact. The future inheritance of the land remained intact. The story would continue, but through a different generation. This balance between judgment and covenant faithfulness runs throughout the Old Testament. Human failure produces consequences, yet God's larger purposes continue moving forward. The events at Kadesh Barnea illustrate both truths simultaneously. Within that larger announcement, two men received a different verdict. Joshua and Caleb stood apart from the rest of their generation. Scripture repeatedly emphasizes that they responded differently to the situation in Canaan. While others focused exclusively on obstacles, Joshua and Caleb maintained confidence in God's ability to accomplish what he had promised. As a result, they were assured that they would eventually enter the land. At first glance, this might appear to be an immediate reward for faithfulness. In reality, the situation was far more complex. Caleb received a promise, but he did not receive immediate possession. The years ahead would test him in a way few people would expect. This marks the beginning of one of the most overlooked periods in Caleb's entire life. Readers naturally gravitate toward dramatic scenes. The mission into Canaan captures attention. The later conquest of Hebron captures attention. Between those two events lies a much quieter story, yet it may reveal more about Caleb's character than either of the dramatic episodes surrounding it. The wilderness years that followed required a different kind of faithfulness. There were no public speeches. There were no decisive victories. There was simply the passage of time, year after year. Israel remained outside the inheritance that had once seemed so close. For Caleb, this created a unique situation. He had been vindicated by God's judgment. His assessment of the land had proven correct. Yet he still shared the experience of the people who rejected his counsel. He would continue traveling with them. He would continue living among them. He would continue witnessing the consequences of decisions he had opposed. This aspect of the story deserves careful attention because it challenges a common misunderstanding about faith. Many people assume that doing the right thing immediately separates them from the consequences created by others. Caleb's experience demonstrates otherwise. He remained faithful, yet he still lived through the years of delay that followed the nation's rebellion. The difference was not that he avoided the wilderness. The difference was that he moved through the wilderness with a future promise still intact. As time passed, Israel entered a period of gradual transition. The generation that left Egypt slowly disappeared from the scene. Fathers and mothers who had witnessed the Red Sea crossing passed away. Former leaders vanished one by one. The camp changed. New children were born. New families emerged. A younger generation grew up hearing stories about events they had never personally experienced. Caleb watched this transformation unfold in real time. Few individuals in Israel possessed a broader perspective on the nation's history. He remembered Egypt. He remembered Sinai. He remembered standing at the border of Canaan before the crisis began. Each passing year deepened the contrast between what had been and what was becoming. There is also a human dimension to these decades that the biblical text leaves largely unstated. Caleb knew where he was supposed to be. He had already seen the land. He had walked through its valleys and hills. He knew the destination existed because he had explored it himself. Yet knowledge did not eliminate waiting. The inheritance remained beyond reach. Such circumstances often produce frustration. Expectations weaken when fulfillment takes longer than anticipated. Initial conviction can fade beneath the weight of prolonged delay. What makes Caleb remarkable is not merely that he believed God at Kadesh Barnea. It is that nothing in the narrative suggests he abandoned that confidence during the years that followed. The silence surrounding his life during this period is itself revealing. Scripture records no dramatic crisis of faith. No complaint attributed to Caleb appears in the text. No indication emerges that he reconsidered the position he took during the spy's mission. The man who trusted God's promise at the border of Canaan appears to have carried that trust quietly through decades when visible progress seemed absent. In many ways, this endurance forms the hidden foundation of his later achievements. Without it, the victories recorded in Joshua would never occur. The wilderness years also transformed Caleb into something increasingly rare within Israel. He became a living witness to events that younger generations knew only through memory and tradition. As more members of the older generation died, the number of people who could personally testify about the Exodus, Sinai, and the original mission into Canaan continued to shrink. Caleb remained among them. His life preserved continuity between Israel's past and its future. He carried first-hand knowledge of both God's deliverance and Israel's failure. Eventually, however, the long period of waiting approached its conclusion. The generation defined by unbelief was passing away. A new generation stood ready to move where their parents had refused to go. The promise that once seemed delayed indefinitely was beginning to draw near once again. Caleb had spent decades watching history unfold around him. Soon he would discover whether the confidence he maintained through all those years would finally lead him back to the land he never stopped believing God would provide. The long wilderness era did not end suddenly. It faded gradually as one generation gave way to another. The men and women who had left Egypt were disappearing from the national landscape, while their children were stepping into positions of responsibility. By the time Israel approached the eastern side of the Jordan River, the nation looked very different from the community that had stood at Kadesh Barnea decades earlier. Most of the people preparing to enter Canaan had never witnessed the plagues of Egypt. They had never walked through the divided waters of the Red Sea. They had never stood at the border of the Promised Land during the crisis caused by the spies. Their understanding of those events came through memory, tradition, and the testimony of survivors. Among those survivors stood Caleb. His presence carried significance beyond his personal story. He represented continuity. He had experienced every major chapter of Israel's journey, from deliverance and covenant to rebellion and judgment. As the old generation vanished, individuals like Caleb became living links between Israel's past and its future. The transition accelerated following the death of Moses. Few moments in Israel's history carried greater symbolic weight. For 40 years, Moses had served as the central human leader of the nation. He confronted Pharaoh, received the law, mediated disputes, and guided Israel through countless crises. Yet even Moses would not enter the land. His death marked the conclusion of an era that had defined the nation's identity since the Exodus. Leadership now passed to Joshua, the same man who had stood beside Caleb during the confrontation at Kadesh Barnea. This detail is more important than it might initially appear. The two men who resisted the fear of their generation were now among the last remaining representatives of that generation. One would lead the nation into Canaan. The other would witness the fulfillment of a promise he had carried for decades. The crossing of the Jordan River became the first major challenge facing this new chapter of Israel's history. Modern readers sometimes underestimate the significance of rivers in the ancient world. Rivers functioned as natural barriers, strategic boundaries, and obstacles capable of shaping military campaigns. The Jordan separated Israel from the land it had anticipated for generations. Crossing it was not simply a matter of travel. It marked the formal transition from wilderness existence to territorial inheritance. Everything that happened afterward would unfold within a different historical reality. The nation was no longer approaching the promise. It was about to step into it. According to the biblical narrative, the crossing itself occurred under extraordinary circumstances. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant entered the river, the waters stopped flowing, allowing the people to pass through on dry ground. The event deliberately echoes the earlier crossing of the Red Sea, creating a literary and theological connection between the beginning of Israel's journey and its next major stage. The first generation had been delivered through water as they left Egypt. The second generation crossed through water as they entered Canaan. These parallels reinforced an important message. The God who initiated the story was still guiding it. Caleb was among the few individuals who personally witnessed both events. He had seen the waters of the Red Sea open decades earlier, And now he watched another generation experience a defining moment of its own. This perspective gave him a unique place within the nation. Most Israelites could speak about one chapter of the story. Caleb could speak about nearly all of them. Following the crossing, Joshua instructed the people to establish memorial stones taken from the riverbed. The purpose of these stones was educational rather than decorative. Future generations would see them and ask questions about their meaning. Parents and leaders would then recount the story of God's faithfulness. This emphasis on remembrance appears throughout Israel's history, because memory played a vital role in covenant identity. Nations often preserve themselves through monuments, documents, and traditions. Israel preserved itself through acts of remembrance connected to God's actions in history. Caleb's own life mirrored that pattern. His continued presence served as a living reminder of promises made long ago and promises now coming to fulfillment. Yet, despite the significance of the Jordan crossing, entering the land did not eliminate future challenges. The river marked a beginning rather than a conclusion. Canaan still contained fortified settlements, regional kings, and competing political interests. Possessing the land would require years of military campaigns and tribal organization. The younger generation now faced responsibilities their parents had refused to accept. The difference was not that the obstacles had disappeared. The difference was that the nation was finally moving forward despite them. This distinction reveals one of the most important developments between the two generations. The earlier generation allowed fear to determine its response. The new generation was being asked to act despite uncertainty. Caleb's role during this period is often overshadowed by Joshua, whose leadership naturally occupies the center of the narrative. Yet Caleb's presence remains significant precisely because he embodies a lesson the younger generation needed to understand. Delayed fulfillment does not mean abandoned purpose. The years in the wilderness had not erased God's promise. They had only postponed its realization. Every step taken west of the Jordan demonstrated that the destination remained exactly where God said it would be. The same land Caleb had explored decades earlier still awaited distribution among the tribes. The same inheritance promised long ago still remained available. As military campaigns gradually unfolded across Canaan, the national focus shifted toward securing territory and establishing a permanent presence in the land. Battles would be fought. Alliances would rise and fall. Tribal inheritances would eventually be assigned. Caleb observed these developments not as a spectator, but as someone whose own story was approaching a decisive moment. The promise attached to his life had not yet been fulfilled. He had crossed the Jordan, but he had not yet received the inheritance specifically connected to him. That chapter still lay ahead. Soon, after decades of waiting, Caleb would step forward with a request that surprised everyone around him. At an age when most people seek comfort and security, he would ask for one of the most challenging territories in all of Canaan. By the time the major phases of the conquest were drawing to a close, Israel had entered a new stage of national life. The urgency of invasion was gradually being replaced by the practical work of settlement. Tribal boundaries were being discussed. Territories were being allocated. Families were preparing to establish permanent roots in the land their ancestors had anticipated for centuries. For many people, this was the moment to enjoy the results of years of struggle. The most dangerous campaigns were largely behind them. The focus was shifting from conquest to inheritance. It was during this transition that Caleb stepped forward and made one of the most remarkable requests recorded in the Book of Joshua. The scene itself is striking because of who Caleb had become. Decades had passed since the mission into Canaan. The young tribal leader who once stood before an anxious nation was now an elderly man. Many of his contemporaries were gone. Entire generations had risen and fallen since the events at Kadesh Barnea. Yet when Caleb approached Joshua, there is no indication of resignation, nostalgia, or decline. Instead, he spoke with clarity and purpose, recalling events that had occurred nearly half a century earlier, as though they remained vividly present in his memory. He reminded Joshua of the promise associated with the land he had explored during the days of Moses. The passage reveals something profound about Caleb's understanding of time. Most people gradually adjust their expectations as years pass. Delayed hopes are often reinterpreted, reduced, or quietly abandoned. Caleb appears to have done none of those things. The promise had aged, but his confidence in it had not. One of the most memorable statements in the entire narrative appears during this conversation. Caleb declared that he remained as strong for service and battle as he had been when Moses first sent him into Canaan. Modern readers naturally debate how literally this statement should be understood. Some scholars view it as an expression of continued vigor rather than a precise biological assessment. Others regard it as evidence of exceptional vitality, preserved through divine blessing. Whatever interpretation one adopts, the central point remains clear. Caleb was not approaching Joshua to request retirement. He was not seeking protection from future challenges. He was presenting himself as a man still prepared to participate in the work that lay ahead. This attitude alone would have distinguished him from many others of his age. Yet, the true surprise emerged when Caleb identified the territory he wanted. Rather than asking for a peaceful region already secured by Israelite control, he requested the hill country surrounding Hebron. To modern readers unfamiliar with the geography of the conquest narratives, the significance of this request can be easy to miss. Hebron was not simply another parcel of land waiting to be assigned. It occupied a strategic and historically important region in the southern highlands of Canaan. More importantly, it remained associated with some of the most formidable inhabitants in the land. The descendants of Enoch were still connected with the area. The very name Anak carried historical weight within Israel's collective memory. For decades, it had been associated with intimidation, uncertainty, and the crisis that unfolded after the spies returned from their mission. This context transforms Caleb's request into something far more significant than a simple inheritance claim. He was not choosing the easiest territory available. He was intentionally choosing one of the most challenging. The decision reveals a pattern visible throughout his life. Caleb consistently moved toward responsibilities that others preferred to avoid. At Kadesh Barnea, he confronted public opinion when most people surrendered to fear. During the wilderness years, he maintained confidence while others lost hope. Now, in old age, he once again selected the path that required courage rather than comfort. The request also carries deep symbolic significance. Hebron occupied a unique place in Israel's history long before Caleb expressed interest in it. The city was connected to the patriarchal traditions reaching back to Abraham. It was associated with the cave of Machpelah, where key figures in Israel's ancestral story were buried. In many respects, Hebron represented one of the oldest physical links between the covenant promises and the land itself. By requesting Hebron, Caleb was not merely seeking territory. He was placing himself within a location deeply connected to the origins of Israel's identity. The past and the future converged in that single request. There is another dimension to this moment that often receives less attention. Caleb's decision challenges common assumptions about aging. Ancient societies respected elders for their wisdom, but military leadership was typically associated with younger generations. Caleb does not reject the realities of age, yet neither does he allow age to define the limits of his usefulness. His speech contains no sense of entitlement based on past service. He does not argue that he deserves an easy assignment because of previous sacrifices. Instead, he continues evaluating opportunities through the lens of purpose and responsibility. This perspective helps explain why his story has resonated across generations. Caleb embodies a vision of faithfulness that remains active rather than passive. His later years are not portrayed as a period of withdrawal from meaningful work. They become the setting for one of his greatest acts of confidence. Joshua's response to the request was immediate. He blessed Caleb and granted the inheritance. The significance of this approval extends beyond administrative procedure. Joshua had known Caleb for decades. He had stood beside him during the crisis involving the spies. He had witnessed the years of waiting that followed. His approval acknowledges more than a legal claim to territory. It recognizes a lifetime characterized by consistency. The promise, first associated with Caleb during the days of Moses, was now moving toward fulfillment. Yet one important reality remained. Receiving the territory on paper was not the same as possessing it in practice. Hebron still had to be secured. The region still contained challenges. The descendants of Enoch had not vanished simply because an inheritance had been assigned. Caleb had obtained permission to pursue the mountain he desired. The next step would require action. Once again, the defining question of his life would not concern what he had been promised. It would concern what he was willing to do in response to that promise. Standing before Joshua, the elderly warrior chose the hardest mountain in the land. Soon he would have to prove that his confidence was more than words. Joshua's approval settled one question, but it left another unanswered. Caleb had received the inheritance he requested, yet possession still required action. The hill country of Hebron was not an empty landscape waiting for new occupants. It remained connected to powerful inhabitants whose presence had shaped Israel's history for decades. The biblical record identifies three prominent descendants of Anak in the region: Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Their names appear only briefly in the narrative, but their significance extends far beyond the limited space they occupy in the text. They represented the final, visible reminder of a fear that once altered the course of an entire generation. Long before Caleb arrived to claim Hebron, the Anakim had already achieved an almost legendary status within Israel's collective memory. When the spies explored Canaan years earlier, reports concerning these imposing inhabitants helped trigger one of the greatest crises in the wilderness period. Over time, the Anakim became more than a people group. They evolved into a symbol. Their reputation embodied everything that seemed intimidating about entering the Promised Land. Stories about them circulated through families. Their name became associated with strength, uncertainty, and danger. By the time Caleb confronted them in Hebron, the psychological influence of the Anakim may have been as significant as their physical presence. This context makes the events at Hebron particularly meaningful. Caleb was not merely securing territory. He was confronting a challenge deeply woven into Israel's historical memory. The narrative presents a striking contrast. Earlier generations encountered the reputation of the Anakim and chose retreat. Caleb encountered the reality of the Anakim and chose engagement. The difference reveals one of the central themes running throughout his life. He consistently refused to allow fear to determine his course of action. The biblical account records that Caleb drove out the descendants of Enoch from the region. The text provides relatively few military details, a characteristic common in many Old Testament narratives. Modern readers often expect extensive descriptions of battles, strategies, and tactical movements. Biblical authors frequently focus elsewhere. Their interest lies less in reconstructing every military event, and more in explaining why certain events matter within the larger story of God's relationship with His people. As a result, the conquest of Hebron is presented primarily through its significance rather than its mechanics. The importance of the victory becomes clearer when viewed within the broader narrative arc stretching back to Numbers 13 and 14. The same region that once contributed to national panic now became part of Caleb's inheritance. The same category of opponents that once appeared overwhelming had been overcome. The outcome did not suggest that the Anakim were imaginary or insignificant. On the contrary, the story works precisely because they were considered formidable. Their defeat carries weight because the challenge was real. The biblical narrative does not celebrate denial of danger. It celebrates perseverance in the presence of danger. Hebron also occupies a unique place within the geography of biblical history. Long before Israel entered Canaan, the city was associated with Abraham and the patriarchal traditions. The cave of Machpelah, traditionally connected with the burial of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah, was located there. This connection gives Hebron a significance extending far beyond military conquest. The region functioned as one of the oldest physical links between Israel's ancestral past and its present reality. When Caleb received Hebron, he inherited more than strategic territory. He inherited a location deeply embedded within the covenant story itself. The promises first associated with Abraham centuries earlier, now intersected with the life of a man who had spent decades trusting those promises would be fulfilled. There is an important lesson hidden within the timing of this event. Human beings often imagine fulfillment arriving quickly once obstacles begin to disappear. Caleb's experience unfolded differently. The fulfillment of God's promise involved years of preparation, seasons of waiting, and challenges that remained difficult even after the waiting ended. Entering the land did not automatically secure Hebron. Receiving Hebron did not automatically remove opposition. The story progresses through stages rather than shortcuts. This gradual movement reflects a pattern frequently found throughout Scripture. Divine promises are real, yet they often unfold through processes rather than instant resolutions. Another fascinating aspect of Caleb's victory is its effect on historical memory. For decades, the Anakim occupied a central place in stories about fear. After Hebron, the narrative emphasis shifts. Future generations would remember the region not merely as the home of powerful adversaries, but as the inheritance of Caleb. The location itself became a testimony to perseverance. Places often carry symbolic meaning in biblical literature, and Hebron is no exception. It transformed from a reminder of what Israel once feared into a reminder of what faithfulness eventually achieved. This transformation helps explain why Caleb's story continued to resonate long after the conquest period ended. Readers across centuries recognized that the deeper issue was never the Anakim themselves. The deeper issue involved how people responded when confronted by challenges that appeared larger than their own abilities. Caleb's life offered one answer to that question. He neither ignored obstacles nor surrendered to them. He acknowledged their existence while refusing to grant them ultimate authority over his future. The victory at Hebron therefore functions as more than a military success. It serves as the culmination of a journey that began many years earlier, when a group of spies entered Canaan for the first time. Everything that followed, the rebellion, the judgment, the wilderness years, the crossing of the Jordan, and the allocation of the land, eventually converged at this moment. The promise first associated with Caleb had finally become reality. Yet the importance of his story cannot be measured solely by the territory he gained. Land was the visible result. The deeper achievement was the consistency that carried him from promise to fulfillment. As significant as Hebron was, Caleb's greatest contribution to Israel's history would not be found in geography alone. It would also be found in the influence he left behind, an influence that would continue shaping future generations long after the battles were over. The conquest of Hebron could easily be viewed as the natural conclusion of Caleb's story. The promise had been fulfilled. The inheritance had been secured. The challenge that once loomed over an entire generation had finally been overcome. Yet, the biblical narrative does not end with Caleb standing triumphantly on his mountain. Instead, it shifts attention toward the people connected to him. This transition is important because it introduces a different measure of success. Up to this point, the story has focused primarily on Caleb's decisions, his endurance, and his faithfulness. Now, the focus broadens. The question is no longer what Caleb accomplished during his own lifetime. The question becomes what remained after those accomplishments were complete. One of the next episodes associated with Caleb concerns the city of Kiriath Sefer, later known as Debir. Following the capture of Hebron, additional territories still required attention. Caleb announced that whoever succeeded in capturing the city would receive his daughter Aksa in marriage. Modern readers sometimes approach this passage with uncertainty, because the social customs of the ancient Near East differ significantly from contemporary expectations within the world of the Old Testament. However, marriages among prominent families often carried communal and political significance. The arrangement was not merely a personal matter. It also functioned as a way of recognizing leadership, responsibility, and demonstrated capability within the community. The man who answered the challenge was Othniel. According to the biblical text, he belonged to Caleb's extended family network through Kenaz. The precise genealogical relationship has been interpreted in different ways by scholars, but the broader point remains clear. Othniel emerged from the circle of people closely connected to Caleb. More importantly, he proved himself through action. He captured the city and secured the right to marry Aksa. The narrative presents this achievement without unnecessary embellishment. Othniel is not introduced through lengthy speeches or dramatic declarations. His character is revealed through what he accomplishes. This approach mirrors a recurring pattern in biblical literature, where actions often carry greater interpretive weight than self-description. At first glance, the episode may seem like a relatively minor family story placed within larger conquest narratives. A closer examination reveals something more significant. The biblical text is beginning to trace the continuation of influence across generations. Caleb's story has never been solely about individual success. Throughout the narrative, his choices affected the people around him. Now, readers begin to see how that influence extended into the future. The attention given to Othniel and Aksa signals that Caleb's legacy would not be confined to his own achievements. It would continue through those who followed him. Aksa herself emerges as a far more active figure than many readers initially expect. After her marriage, she approached Caleb regarding the land she had received. Recognizing the practical realities of life in the region, she requested access to water sources in addition to the territory already granted. In an agricultural society, this was not a trivial concern. Productive land depended upon reliable water. Without it, even valuable territory could become difficult to cultivate and sustain. Aksa demonstrated an awareness of this reality and acted accordingly. Her request reflects initiative, foresight, and practical judgment. Rather than portraying her as passive, the narrative presents her as someone capable of recognizing what was necessary for long-term success. Caleb's response is equally revealing. He granted her request, providing both upper and lower springs. The exchange offers one of the few glimpses into his family relationships, and it subtly expands the portrait developed throughout the narrative. Readers already know Caleb as a man of courage and perseverance. This scene reveals another dimension. He appears willing to recognize wisdom when it is presented and generous enough to support it. The interaction may be brief, but it contributes to a fuller understanding of the environment surrounding him. The values associated with his household extend beyond military achievement. They include responsibility, initiative, and stewardship. The significance of Othniel becomes even clearer when the story moves beyond the conquest period into the era of the judges. There, Othniel emerges as the first major judge raised up to deliver Israel after Joshua's generation passed from the scene. This development transforms what initially appears to be a small family episode into an important historical bridge. Through Othniel, the influence connected to Caleb reaches into an entirely new chapter of Israel's history. The generation responsible for securing the land was giving way to a generation responsible for preserving life within it. Othniel would play a role in that transition. This broader perspective helps explain why the biblical authors preserve these details. Ancient leaders are often remembered primarily for personal accomplishments. Caleb's story gradually points in another direction. His influence extended beyond the boundaries of his own lifetime. The courage displayed at Kadesh Barnea did not disappear when he grew older. The endurance demonstrated during the wilderness years did not vanish once Hebron was secured. The values shaping his life continued to appear in people connected to him. This continuity is one of the strongest indicators of lasting leadership. Achievements can be impressive. Influence that survives into the next generation is often more significant. Another important observation emerges from the structure of the narrative itself. The story of Asa and Othniel follows immediately after the conquest traditions connected with Caleb. This arrangement creates a subtle literary effect. Readers move directly from discussions of territory and warfare into discussions of family, inheritance, and future leadership. The transition reflects a larger truth about Israel's settlement in the land. Conquest was never intended to be the final goal. The objective was the creation of a community capable of flourishing within the inheritance God had provided. In that sense, the stories of Asa and Othniel represent the next stage of the mission. The focus shifts from acquiring the land to building a future within it. As Caleb's personal story begins approaching its conclusion, the biblical narrative invites readers to consider a deeper question. What quality made such a legacy possible? What explains the consistency visible throughout his life, from the wilderness to Hebron, and from his own achievements to the influence he left behind? The answer lies not in military ability, political power, or family success. It lies in a characteristic that Scripture repeatedly emphasizes whenever Caleb's name appears. To understand the true source of his legacy, we must examine the description that became inseparable from his identity. He was a man who followed the Lord wholeheartedly. By the end of Caleb's story, readers have witnessed a remarkable sequence of events. A leader from Judah stood against the fears of his generation. He endured decades of waiting without abandoning the promise he received. He crossed into the land that others never reached. He claimed one of the most difficult regions in Canaan and left an influence that extended into the next generation through Asa and Othniel. Yet, when the biblical text reflects upon Caleb's life, it does not summarize him primarily as a warrior, a conqueror, or a tribal leader. Instead, it repeatedly returns to a specific description. Caleb is remembered as a man who wholly followed the Lord. This phrase appears several times across the biblical record, making it one of the most important keys to understanding who Caleb truly was. The repetition itself deserves attention. Biblical authors rarely emphasize a particular description without purpose. When a characteristic appears again and again, it signals that readers should view the person's entire life through that lens. In Caleb's case, the phrase functions almost like an interpretive guide, rather than focusing first on his achievements. Scripture directs attention toward the inner orientation that produced those achievements. The victories, the endurance, and the influence all emerge from a deeper source. To understand Caleb's legacy, one must first understand what the biblical writers meant when they described him as someone who followed the Lord wholeheartedly. The idea carries more depth than many modern readers initially assume. In contemporary language, wholeheartedness is often associated with enthusiasm, sincerity, or emotional commitment. The biblical concept reaches further. Within the Old Testament, following God wholeheartedly points toward undivided loyalty. It describes a life that remains consistently aligned with God's purposes, rather than alternating between trust and compromise. The emphasis is not on emotional intensity alone. It is on constancy. Caleb's commitment was not activated only during dramatic moments. It remained visible across different seasons of life, including success, uncertainty, waiting, and responsibility. This consistency explains why the phrase fits him so well. Looking back across the narrative, one begins to notice that Caleb's defining quality was not extraordinary courage by itself. Courage was a result rather than a cause. The deeper issue involved allegiance. At Kadesh Barnea, Caleb did not arrive at a different conclusion because he possessed superior military knowledge. He reached a different conclusion because he evaluated the situation through a different hierarchy of priorities. Many Israelites looked first at the obstacles. Caleb looked first at the covenant. The same pattern appears throughout the rest of his story. During the wilderness years, he did not continue trusting because circumstances improved. In many respects, they became more difficult. He continued trusting because his confidence was anchored in something larger than immediate circumstances. Later, when he requested Hebron, his willingness to pursue a difficult inheritance did not emerge from recklessness. It emerged from the same conviction that had guided him for decades. The source remained unchanged, even as the situations changed. This perspective helps explain why Caleb occupies such a distinctive place within the Old Testament. Many biblical figures display impressive moments of faith. Some experience extraordinary victories. Others perform important acts of obedience. Caleb's uniqueness lies in the continuity of his response. From the first major appearance of his character until the last, the narrative reveals remarkable stability. There are no dramatic reversals, no episodes of abandonment, no extended periods in which he drifts away from the convictions that defined him earlier. This does not mean Scripture presents him as flawless. The Bible never claims that any human being apart from God is without weakness. Rather, it means that Caleb's overall direction remains consistent throughout the story. The path he chooses in one chapter is the same path he continues following in the next. Another important aspect of wholehearted devotion involves patience. Modern discussions of faith often emphasize belief, but the biblical narrative frequently emphasizes endurance. Trust becomes most visible when fulfillment has not yet arrived. Caleb's life illustrates this principle repeatedly. The promise associated with him did not reach completion immediately after he demonstrated faithfulness. Years passed. Entire generations passed. The fulfillment remained future. Yet Scripture never portrays him as a man constantly demanding explanations for the delay. Instead, he appears prepared to live faithfully within the time frame God provided. This patience does not receive as much attention as his courage, yet it may be equally important. Remaining committed during seasons of waiting often requires a deeper level of trust than acting during moments of crisis. There is also a theological dimension to Caleb's story that extends beyond his individual experience. Throughout the Old Testament, God consistently evaluates people according to standards that differ from conventional measures of success. Ancient societies often admired military power, wealth, political influence, and public status. Those qualities certainly had importance, but Scripture repeatedly directs attention elsewhere. The condition of the heart occupies a central place in biblical theology. This does not mean actions are unimportant. Rather, actions reveal underlying loyalties. Caleb's life demonstrates this principle with unusual clarity. His choices matter because they consistently reflect trust in God. The visible actions and the inner commitment remain connected. This connection also sheds light on why Caleb's influence extended beyond his own lifetime. The examples of Asa and Othniel explored in the previous chapter illustrate that leadership is not merely the ability to accomplish tasks. It is the ability to cultivate values that continue shaping others. Caleb's legacy endured because the foundation beneath it was stable. Temporary enthusiasm rarely produces lasting influence. Consistent faithfulness often does. The people who leave the deepest mark on history are not always those who achieve the most spectacular victories. Frequently, they are those whose character remains dependable across long periods of time. Caleb belongs firmly within that category. His story continues to resonate because it addresses a challenge that transcends historical context. Every generation encounters moments when trust is tested by uncertainty. Every generation faces situations in which visible circumstances appear more convincing than future promises. Caleb's life offers a response to that challenge. He demonstrates what it looks like to maintain a clear sense of allegiance when competing pressures demand attention. The significance of his example does not depend upon the specific details of ancient Canaan. It rests upon a principle that remains recognizable across cultures and centuries. The reason Scripture remembers Caleb so vividly is not because he accomplished what no one else could accomplish. It is because he remained committed when many others changed direction. As the narrative approaches its conclusion, this repeated description becomes increasingly significant. The phrase, "wholly followed the Lord," is not simply a compliment attached to Caleb's name. It is the thread connecting every major stage of his life. It explains his response to the spy's report, his endurance in the wilderness, his confidence before Joshua, his determination at Hebron, and the influence he left behind. The more closely one examines the story, the more apparent it becomes that this single characteristic shaped everything else. Caleb's legacy was not ultimately built upon strength, opportunity, or circumstance. It was built upon a lifelong pattern of unwavering loyalty to God. Looking back across the entire story of Caleb, what stands out most is not a single event, but a remarkable continuity stretching across decades of history. His life intersects with some of the most important transitions in the Old Testament. He lived through the final years of Israel's experience in Egypt. He witnessed the Exodus. He stood among the people at Sinai. He participated in the mission to Canaan. He endured the wilderness years, crossed the Jordan River, and received an inheritance in the Promised Land. Few biblical figures appear across such a wide span of events. Yet, the significance of Caleb's story lies in more than the number of historical moments he experienced. It lies in the way he responded to them. The same fundamental orientation remains visible from beginning to end. While circumstances changed dramatically around him, the principles guiding his decisions remained remarkably consistent. One reason Caleb continues to attract attention from biblical scholars, theologians, and ordinary readers is that his story unfolds differently from many other prominent figures in Scripture. The Bible contains accounts of kings, prophets, priests, judges, and military leaders whose actions shaped the destiny of nations. Caleb occupies a more unusual place. He rarely stands at the center of the narrative. Much of the time, larger figures such as Moses and Joshua dominate the story. Yet Caleb repeatedly emerges at critical moments when important decisions must be made. His influence does not come from holding the highest office. It comes from the reliability of his response when difficult choices appear. This distinction helps explain why his legacy has endured. Readers encounter many powerful leaders in biblical history. Far fewer demonstrate the same level of consistency across an entire lifetime. Another remarkable feature of Caleb's story is the way it bridges generations. He belongs to the generation that left Egypt, yet he also becomes part of the generation that enters Canaan. In a sense, his life spans both worlds. He carries first-hand knowledge of God's acts in the past, while simultaneously participating in their fulfillment in the future. This role gives him a unique perspective within Israel's history. Most people experience only one chapter of a larger story. Caleb experiences multiple chapters and remains faithful throughout all of them. The biblical narrative repeatedly presents him as a witness to continuity. God's promises did not change as generations came and went. The destination remained the same even when the people traveling toward it changed. Caleb's life became evidence of that reality. The historical discussions surrounding Caleb also contribute to his significance. Questions regarding the Kenizzites, tribal identity, settlement patterns in Canaan, and the development of early Israel continue to generate scholarly interest. These debates often focus on historical reconstruction and archaeological interpretation. Such discussions are valuable because they help illuminate the world in which the biblical narratives emerged, yet, even amid differing academic perspectives. A broad consensus exists regarding Caleb's role within the story itself. The biblical authors intentionally present him as a model of enduring faithfulness. Whether examined from a literary, theological, or historical perspective, that central portrayal remains remarkably stable. The narrative consistently returns to the same conclusion. Caleb serves as an example of what covenant loyalty looks like when tested across a lifetime. There is also an important lesson embedded within the structure of his story. Many people associate success with immediate results. Caleb's life presents a different pattern. Some of the most significant developments occurred only after long periods of waiting. The promise concerning his inheritance was genuine, but its fulfillment required patience. The opportunity to enter the land existed, but an entire generation delayed its realization. The territory associated with Caleb eventually became his, but not before years of conflict and preparation. This progression reflects a recurring biblical theme. Divine promises often unfold through extended processes rather than instantaneous outcomes. Caleb's experience illustrates how perseverance operates within that reality. He did not control the timing of events, but he controlled his response to them. Another aspect of his legacy involves the transformation of memory. Early in the narrative, places such as Hebron and groups such as the Anakim are associated with uncertainty and fear. By the end of the story, those same elements carry different associations. Hebron becomes linked with inheritance. The Anakim become part of a completed victory rather than an unresolved threat. This transformation reveals something important about the relationship between fear and history. Challenges often appear most powerful before they are confronted. Once they become part of the past, they can acquire an entirely different meaning. Caleb's life demonstrates this process repeatedly. Situations that once generated anxiety eventually became testimonies to perseverance and fulfillment. The influence he left behind also deserves consideration. Through Asa and Othniel, the narrative demonstrates that Caleb's impact extended beyond his own lifetime. His story did not end with personal achievements. It continued through people shaped by the same environment of responsibility, initiative, and faithfulness. This aspect of the narrative reinforces an important biblical principle. Lasting influence is rarely measured solely by what an individual accomplishes personally. It is also measured by what continues after that individual is gone. Caleb's contribution to Israel's history includes both dimensions. He achieved significant things himself, and he helped create conditions that allowed future generations to contribute as well. Ultimately, Caleb's story endures because it addresses questions that remain relevant far beyond the world of ancient Israel. How does a person remain committed when circumstances change? How should promises be understood when fulfillment takes longer than expected? What does faithfulness look like across an entire lifetime rather than a single dramatic moment? The narrative does not answer these questions through abstract theory. It answers them through the life of a man whose choices were observed across decades, Readers watch Caleb encounter opportunities, setbacks, delays, responsibilities, and victories. Through each stage, the same pattern becomes visible. His confidence was not rooted in immediate circumstances. It was rooted in trust that extended beyond those circumstances. For this reason, Caleb's legacy cannot be reduced to the role of a spy, a warrior, or a landowner. Those descriptions capture individual chapters of his story, but not the whole of it. The complete story of Caleb is the story of a man who remained steadfast while the world around him changed. He witnessed triumph and failure, promise and delay, transition and fulfillment. Through all of it, he maintained the same direction. That consistency is why his name continues to be remembered thousands of years later, not because his life was free from challenges, and not because every stage unfolded easily, but because he demonstrated what enduring faithfulness looks like when measured across an entire lifetime. In the end, Caleb's greatest achievement was not the land he received or the battles he won. It was the legacy of unwavering trust that continued long after his journey was complete.